Thank you for joining us. My name is Pam Forster, Manager of Healthcare Solutions with the Inmar Intelligence Healthcare team. Today's panel discussion topic is Reaching DSCSA Readiness by November. During today's discussion, you will hear some of the many questions that are being asked in the industry, with each panelist bringing forward their unique perspective. From a housekeeping perspective, please utilize the Zoom Q&A feature for any questions you may have. We will answer as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Any that we are not able to answer in today's live session, we will follow up with via email to answer them. The panelist presentation represents each individual's point of view. It is not legally binding from a legal or regulatory perspective. This presentation is being recorded and the link will be shared in the follow-up email. Today's presenters are Eric Marshall, Executive Director with PDG, the Partnership for DSCSA Governance, and Principal at the Leavitt Partners. Also joining the panel is Bob Celeste, founder of the Center for Supply Chain Studies. And our final panelist is Inmar's Vice President for Product Strategy, Dwight de Vera. Before we dive into questions, Eric and Bob, can you both briefly share how your organizations work with the industry and FDA? Eric, I guess if we can go with you first.
Happy to. Thanks, Pam, and thank you all for having me, and thank you all for being here. As Pam mentioned, I serve as Executive Director of an organization called PDG, or the Partnership for DSCSA Governance. PDG is a collection of more than 60 industry members across the supply chain, including solution providers in the DSCSA space, working to develop and define a common and shared blueprint for how we get to DSCSA interoperability together.
Great. And Pam, the Center for Supply Chain Studies has done a number of studies on the Drug Supply Chain Security Act and the impact on the supply chain. They also work with PDG in managing a number of work groups that have developed the PDG blueprint that's been published recently.
Awesome. Thank you both. And now here's Dwight to set the stage for today.
So thank you, Pam. And once again, thank you all for joining us for today's panel discussion. So we're here to set expectations of what's required and where we're going to be and where we'll need to be in about 202 days. Now, we purposely wanted to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. So like Pam mentioned, we don't want this to be a spectator sport. We'd love for you to ask your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature. And with that being said, Pam, let's dive into the first discussion topic.
Awesome. Thanks, Dwight. All right. So the first question is full implementation of the DSCSA possible by November 27th. And Eric, I'm going to throw this to you to kick things off.
So, I think part of my take here, right, would be anything's possible, right? And I say that a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also a little bit seriously, right? If you think about all the conversation that's going around about the potential and whether there will be a delay or won't be a delay around the November 27th requirements, I think anything is possible. And I don't know that there's an outcome that you could tell me if you had a crystal ball that would surprise me at this point. When we did this similar webinar about a year ago, I talked a lot about some of the political pressures that are going to kind of weigh against FDA as they consider whether to extend any sort of flexibility around that November 27th deadline. And there are some significant political pressures against that, given the way the law came together and some of the interests that were behind it. And I think, too, you do have to rip the Band-Aid off at some point, right? If we continue to kick the can down the road, I think ultimately we just end up postponing some of the pain and challenge. So you do have to rip the Band-Aid off at some point. That said, I think over the last year since we last spoke on this topic, there have been some counter pressures that have been building as well. One, the DSCSA requires FDA to conduct a small dispenser study, a study conducted by a third party to examine how small dispensers under 25 employees can comply and implement the enhanced drug distribution security requirements. That study was due last May, and we have not seen it. I think at this point, it's highly unlikely that we'll see it before November 27th. And so I know that's a counter pressure that the agency is hearing a lot about. Second, I think there's an increased recognition of the significance and breadth of patient impact to access and supply that will result if there is strict enforcement of the November 27th requirements. And finally, I think there's also a recognition that we aren't all going to wake up on November 27th and suddenly see a deluge of counterfeit product in the supply chain. Part of the DSCSA has been other controls and processes and mechanisms that have been put in place over the last 9+ years to deter that kind of activity. And so I think all of those are some counter pressures that have built over the last 11 or 12 months since we last talked about this. There are a number of industry groups and stakeholders, right, that are starting to raise and float ideas and proposals for how that November 27th deadline could be managed. And across them, I do think there is one common theme that is run through all the ones, at least that I've seen, which is we have to keep going. Whatever happens cannot be a pass. We've got to keep our foot on the gas and maintain the momentum that's been built over the last several years. And so for me, my hope, at least personally, is kind of twofold. One is that there will be some level of regulatory flexibility, whether that takes the form of, a wink and a nod or an exemption or enforcement discretion, I'm not going to get into here today, but I think some level of flexibility and recognition of the complexity of this process is going to be important. And second is that any sort of flexibility is done with a scalpel and not a hatchet, right? This is a complex balance to try to draw. And I think it requires a precise approach. And I think just simply kicking the can down the road and throwing hands up and saying everybody gets an extra year isn't going to advance the ball, isn't going to keep that pressure and that momentum going. And so that's maybe my take on kind of how things have evolved since we last had this conversation. But Dwight, I know you may have some perspectives on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, Eric, I absolutely agree with everything you said. Certainly, one of the things we're going to get into in a moment is not the whole industry. The whole industry isn't going to be ready. And, let's, hear from Bob. And, do you have any quick comments before we kind of move on to the next question?
Well, we know that data flows toward the dispenser and that the manufacturers and wholesalers have been working on this for quite some time. And so first things first, we're trying to work with the manufacturers, wholesalers, and dispensers to at least get transaction information moving. And then as you see some maturity in that area, then we move on to verifying that information. And then lastly, tracing, which is still in more of a pilot phase now.
Awesome. And Eric, what was the date last year? Because I know you came to us from the hospital from you and your wife had just had your son. So what was his birth date?
I think it was 11 months ago to the date. So
there you go.
Almost a year.
Hopefully we're not doing this again in 11 months saying, where's the industry, right? All right. So we can move on to the next question, Marina, please. All right. How does the FDA and/or State Board of Pharmacies plan to enforce compliance with DSCSA regulations? Bob, we're going to start with you to kick things off on your insight on the state boards of pharmacies.
Sure. So if you're a dispenser, you probably already know the state boards inspectors have already been asking for DSCSA transaction information and history information. So you could expect that might move into some of the serialized aspects of this. And so you may find that you may be asked to demonstrate the capability to access transaction information, serialized transaction information, records retention, be able to verify product information, be able to trace a product's ownership. So those are things that you may see at a state level coming from a state inspector.
Great.
Pam, I can kind of build on that from a federal perspective as well. I would remind folks, this is a federal law that was supported by and lobbied by industry, and it does have federal criminal penalties and fines associated with it, right? This is not a good practice, a nice guideline to follow. This is a federal law with federal penalties, and folks do need to take it seriously. That said, right, the reality is FDA enforcement is a much more kind of measured approach to enforcement, right? They inspect. If there are findings, they'll issue a 483. If that has to escalate, they'll escalate to a warning letter, and ultimately enforcement. Those serious rapid penalties tend to be held for egregious bad actors, right? And so what I would tell people is, if you find yourself in that situation, be responsive and be thorough in how you handle that. Yeah, I think one of the other really interesting things to watch as we get into the early days of post November 27th as well is just how far down the supply chain FDA pushes in their authority as well. They have the authority to go all the way down, but as Bob said, right, especially at the pharmacy level, that's historically left to the state boards of pharmacy. And so it'll just be interesting to see how that balance of state FDA relationship and enforcement plays out over time as well.
So it sounds like from an enforcement perspective, we should hopefully be expecting some information from FDA on what their plan is, and realizing that the supply chain starts with the manufacturer and ends with the dispenser. So awesome. All right, our next question. Can dispensers rely on their wholesaler distributors to maintain their compliance with DSCSA? Eric, we're going to start with you on this one, and then we'll get Bob's feedback after yours.
Yeah, and I'm going to modify it slightly and actually answer two questions, right? So can wholesalers serve as a pharmacy's data repository? Yes. Can they handle your compliance for you? No. Right? That's the big distinction that I think people need to recognize and be aware of. The DSCSA does allow you to enter into an agreement as a pharmacy with your wholesaler to hold your TI, TH, TS, 2023 TI and TS data for you and serve as that repository. But there's a lot of other activity and requirements that your wholesaler cannot do for you. They cannot identify or investigate suspect product for you. They cannot execute your process to confirm you're working with authorized trading partners. They cannot respond to a request for information from a regulator or other trading partner. They cannot do the reconciliation to confirm the accuracy of that data. So ultimately, there are a lot of other pieces of it that you as a pharmacy need. You need process, you need control, and you need that ability to access, get to, and use that data that you can rely on your wholesaler to hold for you. And Bob, I know you've given some thought to kind of that access component.
Yeah, I think it's we should be mindful that if you're purchasing from multiple sources, so it may be different wholesalers or even manufacturers if you're doing drop ships and other ways of acquiring product, to be mindful that those sources will need to be accessed or to support investigations, whether that be suspect, illegitimate, or recall product investigations, or tracing requests, or even audits or investigations that might occur from an inspection. So you may have multiple sources. You may be using one solution to gather that information together, but you're still responsible for all of that data and records retention.
Perfect. Dwight, any final comments that you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, in particular, I think one of the quotes that folks in the agency have stated publicly is they see new enforcement powers as a result of DSCSA, and so someone will be monitoring, right? And the rules are changing in the next 200 days or so.
Perfect. Thank you. Where is the industry in regard to readiness? So I'm going to throw it to all three of you. But Eric, since you're first in my video, I'll go with you first, and then Dwight, and then Bob.
All right, well, I'll start with what's probably a fairly obvious answer, right? And Bob's already kind of touched on this a little bit, right? I think there are many who have been actively engaged in the conversation and in the dialogue and in this process for years. And as you move from bigger organizations to smaller organizations, right, the level of awareness and ability to dedicate resource and preparedness starts to decline. Obviously, there are many who are well prepared, but it does start to decline. And similarly, as you move down the supply chain, right, from manufacturer to wholesaler to dispenser, I think you see that wane as well. But that's probably obvious. I think across both those who are well prepared and those who may not be as well prepared, for me, I see three big areas of challenge that are getting a lot of attention and will continue to get a lot of attention between now and November 27th. First is transition inventory. And that comes in a couple of varieties, right? One is manufacturers who have inventory in their facilities that's not aggregated. And so they have a difficult process in figuring out how do I start to send serialized transaction data if I don't have that ability to infer. And then at the wholesalers, they have a different version of that, right? Where they've properly received data with lot level, received product prior to November 27th, lot level data. And now on the outbound, have to figure out how do I start to provide serialized TI and how do I make that connection? So that transition inventory is one point of complexity. Second is just the connections and the ability to actually share and send files and data between trading partners, and actually getting that up and ready, and how many folks still need to be onboarded to those types of connections. And then third is even where you have those established connections and you may actively be sending data and files across those connections, the level of complexity around the quality of the data and the reliability of that data in the experiences and learnings that people have to go through to stabilize that process.
Yeah, I mean, speaking from what we see, I mean, we are in touch with our trading partners on a weekly basis. And one point that does need to be made is that the manufacturers themselves, they kick off this serialization data supply chain process. And, you know, one thing which is kind of an industry fact is that at this moment in time, there's roughly about 50% of the manufacturers that are capable of sending their serialized data to the wholesalers or downstream, but there's a significantly smaller percentage that are actually sending all of their data today. Now we have 200 days left, 6 months, but you know, this is going to be a daunting challenge for the industry. And one of the things that we've seen is that different trading partners are trying to apply commercial pressure to their suppliers to get their trading partners ready. There's that we've seen things like threats of escalating fines. We've seen commercial ultimatums, like if there's a generic manufacturer that's ready and another one that's not ready, we've heard from trading partners saying, hey, you know, we're going to buy from the organization that's ready. And then, you know, certainly there are that dispenser community out there that are feeling squeezed. So without lots of this readiness being ready today, the data being ready today, there's very limited to almost no real test data to test all these downstream systems, potentially in thousands of pharmacies and points of care in the US. So it is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. But Bob, what do you think about industry readiness?
Well, I think you both pointed out that this is sort of a wave that's moving through the supply chain, and at the beginning of the supply chain, they've been working on it a lot longer. They have more experience with the data because if you're a manufacturer, you're obviously creating that data. And I think it was an interesting point that you made there, Dwight, about the test data, not having it yet, waiting for that spigot to get turned on so that you experience it, and you need to be able to work through issues that you will encounter, the exceptions with the data. You know, we're going from a situation where this is more of an order of magnitude change, in that, you know, in the past we ordered by quantity and we received by quantity. Today we'll be ordering by quantity, but receiving and being responsible for eaches and the data that's associated with those eaches. So at the end of the day, whether it is November or it's determined a little bit later for dispensers, we need to have the capability to be able to accept and access that transaction information. We need to be able to support product investigations, be able to support product ownership tracing, be able to have SOPs and processes for identifying and determining whether we are working with an authorized trading partner and we've received data from that type of source. And then lastly, being able to manage records management, from having a 6 years look back to a transaction, and if an investigation is involved, an additional 6 years. So there's quite a bit to be done here. Wholesalers and 3PLs can help with that. but as Eric pointed out, the responsibility remains with each trading partner.
All right. So what is the status of verifying authorized trading partners? And Bob, this is right up your alley, so I'm going to push it right to you.
So the electronic processes of verifying product information, in other words, you read the barcode and you verify that product, that information with the manufacturer, and also tracing ownership through the supply chain, that occurs across networks and between systems. We need a way to determine who the other party is and whether they are, as the DSCSA defines, an authorized trading partner. From a dispenser's perspective, that means that you are providing proof of who you are and that you do hold a legitimate state license. When you verify a product or trace a product, you want to know that you're receiving information from a party that you believe you're dealing with, and that they are an authorized trading partner. So within the PDG blueprint, we've identified two different ways of accomplishing this. One is that you manually contact the other party that you're attempting to either verify or trace product with, and provide information or proof of who you are and your ATP status, and also receive that proof from that other party so you can trust the information that you receive back. A second way is to include digital credentials. And that process is a lot like having something notarized, where you provide proof before you get into transactions, and you receive a digital credential, and actually your system will use that when you electronically try to verify or trace a product. That credential replaces that process that you would have to do in a manual way, and so that you can do this electronically. Provides proof of your identity and your ATP status in online product verifications and tracing. It also allows you to receive proof, electronic proof, from those that you receive data from, either from a verification point of view or a tracing point of view. So those are the two ways that we see people are working through. One, a manual process, and the second one, to be more efficient, is a use of a digital credential.
Perfect. Eric, anything to add?
Yeah, I can tack onto that a little bit. As Bob mentioned, there's been a lot of industry conversation around this credentialing process and activity, and it can get technical quickly. And so I sometimes like to kind of ground people back in the practical. The reality is you have some sort of a credentialing process in place today that you are using, whether that's formal or informal. It may be a formal know your customer, know your supplier kind of a process. Or it may just be as simple as, if you get a request from somebody by email, you hover your mouse over their email address to make sure it's a legitimate email address, right? And not some spam emailer in a Hotmail account. And so what we're talking about here is kind of an enhancement of that process, right? There's some new requirements, as Bob said. You've got to be able to tie that to a license or registration. But the big question then for November 27th and beyond is, one, how do you start to do that at scale? And two, how do you start to do that outside of an established commercial business relationship, right? Today, that is almost exclusively between you and somebody you do commercial business with. So you've vetted them, you're getting product from them, you've probably seen their facilities and signed a commercial contract with them. We move into this world of interoperability in 2023 where, Osterhaus Pharmacy in Maquoketa, Iowa now has to ask a question to Pfizer, and those two have never had any sort of direct relationship with each other. And so how do you start to do that, and what's your process for doing that and doing it at some level of scale? And that's really, to me, where the credentialing piece starts to come into the equation.
Make sure you know who you're doing business with, right? Awesome. All right. Does every product, and this we get asked over and over and over, does every product need to be scanned and reconciled to the electronic purchase data that we receive? Dwight, how about you start this off, and then we'll go to Eric and Bob for their thoughts.
Yeah, certainly. And again, yes, this is a hot topic, especially for the dispenser community, right? And in particular, smaller organizations should really not have an issue with manually reconciling, small quantities and small orders. But larger organizations need to be able to pull this process off without destroying productivity. I mean, one of the least available resources in healthcare today is people, and the way this needs to occur is we need to trust the GS1 standard and the work we've been doing with aggregation and inference. And we need the ability to scan that license plate from a wholesaler tote with heterogeneous product in it, and then really understand electronically and quickly what's in that tote. Now, this will be implemented differently across all of healthcare in the US. And the thing that's very important to note is whatever you choose to do, whether it's reconciling every piece, whether it's accepting aggregation, whether it's sampling, that you document that in your serialization and DSCSA standard operating procedures for scanning, receiving, quarantining, and investigating potential suspect and illegitimate product. But Eric, what are your thoughts about this topic?
Yeah, I think that's right, and I agree with all of that, Dwight. And maybe I would just point people to a couple of documents that might be useful. One of which I will caveat the heck out of. The first one that I'm not caveating is a document that you've heard Bob and I reference, our PDG blueprint for interoperability. So if you go to our website, dscsagovernance.org, under our blueprint tab, you'll find the first chapter of our blueprint, which talks about a little bit of a framework for this that is our view as PDG, aligns to kind of what you're saying there, Dwight. We see this spectrum, right? At one end of the spectrum, you can do what I just call kind of blind trust, right? I got some products, I got an electronic file, must be good, right? I'm just going to blindly trust the data. The other end of the spectrum is actually reconciling every individual unit to the data, one piece by one piece, right? In our view, where we landed as PDG is that you can't just blindly trust the data. You have to have some well-controlled risk-based process for understanding, does your product and your data match up? We also, though, say you don't have to go all the way to checking every unit. You may choose to go to every unit, as you said, Dwight. You can use sampling types of approaches or audit types of procedures and do some portion of that. You need to have some well-controlled risk-based process for how you're assuring that you have a level of confidence that your physical product you're receiving matches up to that electronic data that is coming in with it. The other document I would point to, and this is the one I'm going to caveat, is an FDA guidance that came out in June of 2021 around the enhanced drug distribution security requirements. I want to emphasize it's a draft guidance, and that guidance, more than probably any of the other 24 or so that FDA put out, had a lot of industry feedback and a lot of industry pushback to it. And I expect that there will be changes to that guidance when it's finalized. But it does talk a lot about this reconciliation process. And so even if it changes, I think it's still instructive to understand where FDA's current mind is. And they do very clearly point to some level of expectation around that reconciliation process. So again, draft very much subject to change, but it does at least give you something in terms of where FDA was at as of June 2021.
Perfect. Bob, any final thoughts on this topic?
Well, I'd say that in the PDG work groups, we've been working through exceptions. And one of the things we've learned is that when everything goes well, everything goes well. But when it doesn't go well, it's often hard to unravel what took place from a data perspective. So I just underline both Dwight and Eric's point on standard operating procedures. Make a decision about what you need to scan, whether you need to scan each item or whether you do sampling of products. Also, your experience with your suppliers is really helpful in informing your SOPs around that. You may have some that are more accurate than others, and you need to accommodate for that or accommodate for the lack of accuracy.
Perfect. And Eric, just to follow up with you, you had mentioned the PDG blueprint. If it's okay with you, when we do the follow-up with the video link, is it okay if we put the link to the PDG blueprint in there as well?
Absolutely. We would love that.
Perfect. All right, we'll move on to the next one. And again, if you have any questions, please utilize the Q&A feature. We only have 2 more questions coming up, and then we're going to open up the floodgates. I see Alex from marketing is typing in all the questions that are coming in. So there's a lot of them, guys. Get ready. So I know both Eric and Bob have been involved in multiple industry meetings on this topic. Has the industry discussed how exceptions will be handled, like drop shipments, 340B, and data issues? Bob, you kind of spoke on it a little bit, but I'm going to turn to you to kind of go over the drop shipments and 340B, and then Eric with the exceptions as far as data handling and data issues and stuff like that.
Sure. So in the PDG blueprint, we've identified 3 different ways that that the transaction information for drop ships could be handled. It could be that your wholesaler is willing to pass data through, so from the manufacturer through to you, the dispenser, and that way you'd be receiving that information either in the wholesaler's portal or to you directly from the wholesaler. The second one is that the supplier, whether that was a wholesaler or the manufacturer, may support that data in a portal and provide you data in the shipping documents of how to access that data. And the third one is you may have a relationship with the manufacturer, and so you can prearrange that the manufacturer send that information to you directly in the case of a drop shipment. For 340B, it's always a not straightforward process, but we have provided information in Chapter 3 of the blueprint that it's more prevalent that the wholesaler, knowing both parties, will send TI information to the covered entity and also the contracted entity. So those are just some touch bases. There's quite a few different scenarios that are documented in those in that blueprint about how information and product will flow through the supply chain.
Great. And Eric, on the data issues?
Yeah, so as Bob said, right, when things go well, they go well, and when they don't go well, it's a challenge, right? And I think I would say they do often not go well. I think that's one of the things that we're seeing and experiencing. We're talking about a transition here from lot level data to now starting to share and require data on about 4.5 billion units going through the supply chain every year. So if you multiply that out and assume it is sold twice through the supply chain, and you've got a TI on each end of that transaction, you're talking about 15 to 20 billion individual instances of TI spread around the supply chain per year. And so even if we get to really high rates of accuracy, you're still going to have an absolute number of challenges and discrepancies and errors within that are going to be a challenge to manage in practice. And so it's really about how do we start to manage, how do you manage those early exceptions that we're going to see at higher rates without disrupting patient access? And how do we make sure we're all rapidly and continuously improving and stabilizing those systems and processes? We're probably getting to the point in the webinar where people are starting to drift a little bit. So I'll say, if you hear one thing from me, at least during this conversation, it's that you will have errors in the data coming into your facilities, and you need to plan for those. What is your process for identifying where you have those areas? What's your process going to be for deciding whether that's a suspect product or you're going to treat it as a data error? How are you going to get that data corrected? How are you going to balance that against the need for patient access if you've got a patient standing on the other side of the counter? How are you going to coordinate and collaborate with your trading partners to understand what went wrong and fix it? Those challenges are going to be there, again, hopefully over time, less and less and less frequently. But those challenges are always going to be there, and you need to be prepared and have a process around it.
And I know in many of the different meetings, the wholesale distributors are hoping to really button up on their processes so that they have minimal data issues, because they don't want to be stopping and having to deal with, potentially hundreds of thousands of data issues. So great, thank you. All right, and we're coming up on our last question. So again, any questions you have, please put them in. I keep seeing the number of questions go up. So Dwight, in just 2 days, on May 11th, the COVID public health emergency will be ending. What does that mean for dispensers?
Yeah, so when COVID began, the government was very quick to release guidance relaxing components of DSCSA. Now, while the public health emergency was in effect, vaccines and products used to alleviate or treat symptoms of COVID-19 became exempt. And some of those exemptions included requirements for packaging, tracking, tracing, documentation, and even some some authorized trading partner requirements. But now that these exemptions are going away, we are going to revert back to standard operations, and many of the manufacturers today are even reissuing those same products, like the vaccines, under new identifiers to help minimize the confusion with product that was isolated for dealing with a public health emergency.
I don't know about anybody else, but this public health has been a very long 3 years, and I'm sure healthcare can certainly, attest to that, living it and breathing it every single day. All right, so our final reminder, again, any questions, please put them in. For any dispensers that may be looking for a solution, Inmar will be hosting a DSCSA overview and demonstration of our solution, RX Transparent, on May 24th. So gentlemen, if each of you could take just a few minutes to wrap up any last minute comments that you may have that you didn't get to weigh in on, or anything that you just really want to stick home with that you hope people remember from this panelist discussion, now's the time. So we'll start with you, Bob, if you want to do some recap.
Yeah, I think we're in the I won't say final phases. We're going to be doing this for the next year or two, but testing, and SOP development and exceptions work. To Eric's point before, you will see issues with data, and they need to be worked out properly. Trading partners and solution providers are testing serialized TI transfer and working that through. And hopefully enough of that is getting to the dispenser community that you're able to start to test it, not only with the systems, but with your internal processes. So I think that's important for you to start to be socialized to what the data is, what it means, and how to react to requests for that data that you may receive.
Perfect. Eric?
Yeah, maybe just a few things. One, if you have not started, you have a sprint ahead, and so start sprinting. So it's maybe point one. Two, I mentioned our resource, our blueprint that can give you a little bit of a high-level framework for how to approach those business requirements. Again, on our website, dscsagovernance.org, and you can find that under our blueprint tab. And then finally, is just a reminder, pretty much all of our conversation right here has focused around these November 27th electronic serial level TI exchange and traceability kinds of requirements. But just a reminder that this is one set of requirements that builds on requirements that have been put in place over the last 9 years. Things like making sure you're only working with authorized trading partners, having enhanced systems and processes for identifying suspect product and investigating them, being able to verify that product is legitimate, et cetera. So just a reminder that this is just one piece of the much broader DSCSA puzzle.
And finally, Dwight.
Yeah, well, once again, one of the things I want to say is thank you all for attending today's session. But I think an important statement to make is that November 27th isn't necessarily a finish line. I mean, one of the things that I think we all need to look at is the world's going to be different, but it's much more of a starting line. And then even though we're going to have a bumpy industry stabilization period ahead of us, right? There will be some errors, some issues, things that we need to deal with. There is going to be incredible opportunity to increase, not only supply chain transparency. We can optimize and make sure medications are utilized the way that they were meant to be, and really minimize waste. There's incredible value beyond simple compliance that's right around the corner, and just over and beyond the November 27th date. So Pam, let's take the team off mute and talk about the questions and only give us the easy questions.
All right. Well, the first easy one that we always get is, will this presentation be shared? And yes, we will absolutely on follow-up provide the video link, as well as we will make sure that Eric's website for the PDG blueprint, I did put it in the chat. So that link is in the chat live, but on follow-up, we will also include it in the email. All right. So first, we're going to start with some general questions. Does DSCSA apply to doctors' offices and clinics? Are clinics responsible also with regards to clinic-administered medication? So I'm just going to ask the questions, and then you guys can kind of battle it out unless there's something specific that I know would be Eric or Bob or Dwight or whatever. So.
Can you repeat the first half of that, Pam? I caught the
Does
physician.
DSCSA apply to doctors' offices and clinics? So Eric, you want to go since you asked the question again?
Sure. Yeah. No, I'm happy to win. So I would point people, in the statute, in the DSCSA, up in section 581, there's a definition of dispenser. So that's where you're going to want to start is, are you a dispenser? Do you meet that definition, which is generally anyone authorized to dispense or administer drugs. There is later then a carve out in the statute further down in section 582 for healthcare practitioners that essentially exempts you out of most of the data requirement stuff that we're talking about here on this call. And so ultimately it's going to come down to, are you a dispenser or do you fit within that healthcare practitioner category, right? And it gets a little bit tricky, right? There are doctors' offices who operate and are licensed as a pharmacy, and then there are true independent, physician offices. So it's not as clear cut as it may seem, but those are the two places I would point to, with again the general caveat that healthcare practitioners who are not operating as a pharmacy generally are carved out of these data requirements that we're talking about.
Perfect. Another one, as a long-term care pharmacy, we sell vaccines to nursing homes. Will the nursing home have to meet the requirements also? Dwight, you want to take this one?
Well, I mean, again, it's as a long-term care pharmacy, right? So you are, kind of in this business of actually dispensing and selling medications, right? So, there may be several classifications that you fall under as it relates to this regulation, right? So you may be, in certain cases, a wholesaler, but you certainly are a dispensing type of organization. You do need to consider your requirements under DSCSA and to get compliant. But Bob or Eric, do you have other comments about this question?
I don't, maybe Eric does.
I think you covered it well there. Go ahead.
No.
All right, perfect. All right, let's see. For retail outpatient pharmacies, does the serialization or lot expiration, et cetera, need to be recorded to the prescription level? I.e. every prescription needs to be able to cite each package serialized info, which was used to fill it.
Yeah, actually, I want to comment on this. So the answer is no, right? So DSCSA and drug serialization is it ends at the saleable unit level, essentially the packaging level. So as soon as the product comes into your pharmacy or comes into your facility, the package is opened or destroyed. The packaging is opened or destroyed. It's been decommissioned. It's no longer required to kind of keep track from a data perspective and track and trace perspective. Mathematically, it gets kind of impossible to track medications that came out of a bottle that went into an amber vial that went to a specific patient. The math and the systems just don't exist, and it would multiply that number that Eric mentioned earlier by 5 or 10. So let's not worry about that right now.
Perfect. Question came in. Can Eric repeat what information is expected from the pharmacy if or when the State Board of Pharmacy and or the FDA contacts us?
I don't think I said that, but I'll share what I think I did say, and you just clarify. It ultimately is going to depend on what that request is. But as I was referencing the FDA process, right, they have an escalating series of actions that they take if they find that if they believe you're not in compliance with these requirements. And my main point there was just to be responsive. I think one of the main places that if you talk to any FDA lawyer that they see companies get in trouble is either just flat out ignoring those inquiries from the FDA or not taking them seriously. They tend to be an opportunity to get your process corrected and in place. And so if you get one of those types of inquiries, I would just say be highly responsive and take it very seriously.
Okay, and then another question came in. Has there been any new DSCSA warning letters beyond the one that was issued to the wholesaler and the one dispenser that you guys are aware of?
Those
I
are the
haven't
only
seen
two that
any.
I'm aware of, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. At the dispenser level, is the serial number and or lot number information required in TI?
Spencer levels. Well, I
Beginning
mean,
in 2020, sorry.
Yeah, that's just how the question came in,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, so I would say beginning in November 27th, it is, right? So today it is at the lot level, right? So today you're required, if you're selling product, to provide, and if you're purchasing product, to receive transaction information. That set of, Bob, keep me right here, my number 12 individual elements of TI data. That includes the lot number, who you bought it from, who it was sold to, the product name, strength, dosage, all that kind of information. The addition in 2023 is the addition of the serial number and the expiration date, those two data elements that tie specifically to that individual package. So those are the two new elements that you'll see added to the TI November 27th of this year, and that applies equally manufacturer, wholesaler, repackager, dispenser.
Okay. How do we handle transfers from one pharmacy to another for emergency supply to satisfy a prescription?
I mean, I can, certainly comment, and then, certainly Eric and Bob comment. So, a patient-specific transfer, right, is certainly excluded from the requirements of DSCSA, right? So, this regulation is not meant to potentially harm a patient from access to medications, but to a degree, some of the things that go on today, borrow, trade, loan, I'll pay you back Tuesday, that kind of thing, right? These are the things that are, certainly suspect, beyond November 27th. But Eric and Bob, do you guys have comments about transfers?
Yeah, I think you're right, Dwight. I think that's going to be one of the big shifts, right? As you said, you can continue to do it for specific named patient needs. This is not, hey, I'm running low, can I borrow some and pay you back later? But hey, Sally Jones is here and needs this medication and I have her script. I don't have it. Can I get it from you, right? Specific name patient need. The other thing I will say, right, the law doesn't say you cannot continue to do that. There are just requirements if you continue to lend or sell product to other pharmacies. One, you've got to provide them with this data, right? You have to treat that as a transaction under the statute and give them this serialized transaction data. And two, you may trigger a situation where you're now acting as a wholesaler and have to be licensed as a wholesaler. So it's not so much that you cannot do that activity. There are just some significant obligations that come along with doing that activity.
Awesome. All right, we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're getting a bunch of questions about GLNs. So I know we did our last industry webinar was with Tracy from GS1. So, and we do have a GLN guide that's going to be coming out shortly, but question is, does each pharmacy within a group need an individual GLN number?
Generally, the answer is going to be yes, right? So if a pharmacy's a ship-to location, they're receiving drug product from, say, a wholesaler, right? And that's normally what a pharmacy is doing, then yes, for the data to flow correctly and to follow the GS1 international standard we agreed to, you need a global location number. Now we did do a whole webinar on this with GS1 about if you're an independent pharmacy, their wholesaler may be enumerating and providing GLNs. If you're part of a GPO, they may be doing it, or you can do it yourself, and it's really not that complex of a process.
We order and receive all medications in our inpatient pharmacy. We supply medications to our outpatient surgery departments and other offsite departments. Do we need to track medications we send to them, or would that still be considered part of the hospital ownership or inventory?
Generally, if both entities, the inpatient and the outpatient pharmacy, are under common control, you own more than 50% of it, then no, you probably don't have to do it. There are all kinds of things that are occurring now in healthcare, right? Like you you're a consultant to that other organization, and then you're providing them with medications. In that case, yeah, you probably do need to, kind of set up these commercial arrangements, and then also look at the compliance of that other entity. Eric, do you have any other comment on this, or?
Yeah, so I think you're generally correct, right? From a TI exchange and a requirement perspective, if the two organizations are under common ownership and common control, those are considered affiliates under the statute, and you are not required to exchange and provide that TI data. The one caveat that I will throw in, right, is while that TI data generally stops at basically your receiving dock, right, within your broader corporate organization, you do need to think about your process if you get a notification that, hey, serial number 1279, we think is suspect for some reason, go get it out of the supply chain. How are you going to figure out where in your organization that is and whether you still have that product, right? So this is where Dwight's absolutely right. TI is not required there. Same thing with dispensing, right? You do not have to track your serial number down to the dispensing level, but do be thinking about that process. If you need to go track down a serial number because it's now somebody told you it's suspect or it's been recalled, how are you going to be able to get to that? And it may not be that you have perfect ability to get to it, but at least having your process documented so that you know how you're going to approach that and go through that consideration.
Awesome. All right, this one's for you, Bob, because it's about ATP. Would GLN prove authorization as well in reference to ATP?
Yeah, so the issue here is we're talking about an electronic interaction. In an electronic interaction, it's hard to tell who the other entity is. If you send a GLN through, I can look up your GLN and use your GLN. It doesn't prove that I am that GLN, and that's why we settled on two different ways. One, a manual approach where you'd have a conversation and exchange proofs, and the other one would be an electronic, a digital credential. The credential itself can be verified, so your signatures, the issuer signatures, can be checked on that to know that not only does this represent you, but you actually signed it in a way that you only can control it. So I can't take your credential and give that to someone else and try to prove that I'm you. Whereas a GLN is an identifier, it's not an identity, whereas the credential provides identity and ATP status. Hopefully that helps a little bit.
All right, we have some EPSIS questions coming in. I'm not seeing anywhere that FDA states that it is the responsibility of the receiving pharmacy to scan products on receipt and create the document. Do you have a resource from the FDA for that process?
So I think that's correct. You, as the purchasing entity, right? So if you're staying in the shoes of somebody purchasing the product, you do not have the obligation to necessarily, I would say, create data, right? The person selling you the product is going to send you and provide you with data. That scanning piece that we talked about, again, not mandatory for every unit, but having some process around, checking. What we're talking about there is saying that the data that your seller is sending you, how do you match that up to the physical product you got, right? If you're buying from a wholesaler and they say, here are the 27 serial numbers that I'm sending you in the data, what's your process for checking whether the 27 physical product serial numbers sitting in that tote are aligned with the 27 in that file? And that's where you start to see discrepancies and start to work through that process of, well, what if they said they sent you this, but you actually got that, and there's a misalignment of that data in the product. So it's much more about statutorily, your obligation is to capture and maintain the data that is provided to you and having some process to assure the accuracy of it, not that you're creating data as the purchaser.
And
yeah, I do want to follow up on this one, Pam. In particular, Eric's absolutely right. There isn't a regulatory requirement to use a scanner, but technology like scanning will improve the accuracy of this process and certainly make it faster. There is this reconciliation process, and then there's certainly a process that we haven't talked about where, hey, if you have this product but there's no data for this product, you're going to need to quarantine, right? And then what are your processes for getting that product out of the quarantine, right? And then either possibly sending it back because you'll never get the data, or clearing, right? And then again, that comment of scanning technology just makes it easier. I mean, you can certainly look at the electronic screen and then look at the product and just eyeball it. That'll work too.
Yeah, I think if I recall correctly, the regulation says it can be, the reconciliation process can be done by human readable or machine readable, if I'm not quoting it correctly. Are we supposed to scan the drugs that are already in the pharmacy? So I guess this is prior to November 27th?
Yeah, no, right. So in particular, right, and Eric mentioned this, there's that challenge of, hey, it's November 28th, but a product that came in 2 days ago, right? You know, there was no serialization information, right? And there's going to be this orphan type of non-aggregated product in the supply chain, right? So there are many methods that we're talking about it as an industry of kind of moving that along, maybe pseudo commissioning, that's not official, but maybe, right? But product that's already in your facility today and up to November 27th, you don't need to collect the product identifiers and serial numbers.
All right, we're just about out of time. I'm going to real quick, we've had over 100 questions asked. Any that we don't get to, again, we will follow up and an email, send out responses for. If there were quite a number of questions that were submitted that are specific to RX Transparent, so we put those aside. Dwight and I will be doing a webinar next month for our users, so we'll make sure that we answer those questions in follow-up email as well as next month. I do want to real quick, while we're asking the last few questions, is I'm going to launch a poll, and I know people don't like polls, but this really helps us engaging if you find these panel discussions helpful or informative. So I'm going to launch that and real quick look through. We did get a question about how about samples from sales rep from manufacturers? Do we have to track those?
Yeah, the answer is no, right? So if it's a kind of sample product, it's excluded from DSCSA, and generally the things that pharmaceutical sales reps hand to you are all samples.
How do I request a change in GLN or new GLN number? And does the GLN change if an entity moves?
So
Go ahead, Bob.
I was just going to say that licensing the company prefix is done with in the US with GS1 US. Any changes to the GLN, if you actually move, yeah, there is a process for changing the data that's associated with that GLN.
But the GLN would become different because of the different location, correct?
I think they have recommendations around when you would need to use another GLN, another number. Okay. Depending on if you did move, you probably would need a second GLN to identify that location. Okay. But remember that this is about purchasing sales. So the corporate entity could be doing the purchase, but it's delivered or shipped to particular addresses.
Thank you. So question, what are the penalties associated with non-compliance to DSCSA?
Eric, can you comment about penalties?
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it is a criminal offense, right? So there are significant criminal penalties, ability to seize product. There's potential for jail time. Again, but I want to caution all of that, right? That there are potential for penalties. Those are penalties that FDA would traditionally impose on bad actors, right? A counterfeiter actively, slipping stuff into the supply chain. They have an escalation process. I would not advise you to be concerned that if you transpose a serial number, you're going to jail. But there are significant penalties that you need to be serious about. And that's why I said FDA has a pathway for you to be responsive and to work through any sort of non-compliance that you may run into, but you need to be responsive and take it seriously. Don't take it lightly. But again, recognize that the criminal penalties that are there, right, are typically reserved for those who are truly egregious bad actors.
Perfect. And we are at the witching hour, 3 o'clock for those live. So Marina, if you could go to the next slide, please. Awesome. On behalf of Eric, Bob, Dwight, and myself, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Special thank you to Marina and Alex, our marketing team, for all the behind the scenes help with coordination and monitoring, as I said, over the 115 questions that we've received. We hope you found this information informative and easy to understand. Please be sure to check out Inmar's Thought Leadership page for other video or webinars that may interest you. And if you have any questions we were not able to answer today, please email them to us. You have the information on the screen, solutions@inmar.com. Thanks again and have a great day.
Thanks, Pam.
Thanks, everyone.